Behind me is the swamp that we're going to walk today to begin the process of making a basket from natural materials. We're in the beautiful rolling hills of the Berkshires in Massachusetts. In front of me is Hancock Shaker Village. Behind me is the swamp we're going to begin to walk to look at for that elusive black ash that everybody wants to see. So we're going to look at that, and we're going to walk you from the entire process, from walking in the swamp today to a finished basket in the studio. I hope you'll join me. We're standing in front of a black ash tree, and I want to point out a little bit about what the tree looks like in its natural habitat. We're standing in a very boggy, kind of cold, swampy area. Frequently beavers like this kind of setting, and there's some water off in the distance which they can dam up. The tree, this one, happens to be extremely good. It's a very straight one, no knots showing in the lower quadrant of the tree, and I would be able to go up probably a good 10 feet on this tree before I'd hit a real significant knot. That's what you look for. Frequently you'll find a black ash tree in the habitat of other hardwoods, but it has to be a swampy, wet area or along the side of a really rolling brook or something where the tree has had a chance to really get good moisture. In this swamp, for instance, we have a really wet base, and so the tree has had good growth, and I'm going to get growth rings that are very uniform and in pretty good quality. Sometimes you'll have to draw knife that off if you find that your area that you take the tree in has been drought-stricken. So the tree itself is scaly and corky and brown. You can see with my fingers I can take the bark off. And it's not a deeply furrowed tree such as white ash. However, white ash can be used and pounded for splint as well. This tree is exceptionally tall, and it's an incredibly good one. The growth pattern of this tree normally is half-sick top. The leaf structure is on a stem of 12 to 16 inches with compound leaves opposite each other. No lead stem off the leaf. So there's a central stem, and then the leaves come directly off of it. This kind of tree is hard to find, this quality tree, and usually when there's one, there's several, so don't really jump at the first tree that you see. Select carefully. Remember, you're in the woods, get permission, don't go alone, don't cut the tree by yourself if you're unfamiliar with it. This is one of the things that you need to learn about the tree. You need to return it to the soil if you're not going to cut it all up for firewood. And after you cut the tree down and get it out, we'll show you how to pound that tree and get your splint prepared. We've cut the tree into a short length here in order to make it easier to handle, and I've already pounded the log quite a bit. One thing that you need to learn about the basket log, or the basket tree as it was sometimes called, is that you cannot rush the pounding process. And the other thing about the log is it's lighter in the outside and darker as you go in, and that's why it's called black ash, because it gets a real dark brown center. The other kind of interesting tidbit about the basket tree is that the deal was that you traded a basket for this tree, and people in the 18th and 19th century considered that to be an excellent exchange, because this log isn't really good for much more than basket making. So I've taken off quite a bit of the layers already by pounding, and let me just show you a little bit about the method and the even rhythm of pounding. You don't jump around like you're playing a xylophone. We'll pound the log a little bit, show you how the wood comes up. It's going to take the first day is not going to yield you many splints, and you want to pound the log and not rush the process. If you rush the process, you'll rip it, and once you rip it, you've ruined the piece of splint. So, do it very carefully. Take a wooden mallet. This is a maple mallet. The growth rings that we've talked about previously are running this way, and I've put an arrow here and here so that I'm hitting on the end of this grain rather than this way. If I hit this way, I'm going to delaminate even the mallet, and we're going to delaminate the log as it is. With the log either fresh or soaked in a pond, you continue to keep it wet rather than let it dry out. If you're going to pound the entire log, get it over with. If you're not, keep it soaked. You can't let it dry and then hope to get it reconstituted or re-softened by soaking it. It's just going to take too long. Indians frequently coated the log with mud to keep it from drying out. So we'll just pound away and very rhythmically overlap the strokes. You can see that the splint, having been pounded before, is now beginning to lift. You don't just rip it. You let it come up naturally and don't force it. If it drags or pulls and sort of sticks, you haven't pounded it enough. I'm overlapping the blows. You can see that the piece is beginning to come off quite easily, but this is going to take quite a bit of work. A large log, 10 feet long and maybe a foot in diameter if you're lucky enough to find one, will serve you about 35 to 50 good-sized farm baskets. It will serve you several hundred up in splint, so it's good to find as large a log knot-free as possible. I'd like to show you an alternate method as well of pounding where you don't use a trip hammer, but in fact split the log out into smaller pieces, and we'll pound that in a different fashion. This is a piece of billeted log. I've split it into pie-shaped wedges. I've taken the heartwood out. I start to pound that piece on the end to get it so it starts to separate. You can see that it's begun to start a little bit here already. And then I'll push it over the edge of a log, and this will act like a fulcrum. I'll then hit it strongly on the end of the piece. And you can see that flexing downward. I've already broken that out quite a bit. You can see where the splints have begun to separate. It's called shear stressing. And that way you can go the whole length of the log and separate it that way. And that's just an alternate method that the Indians frequently use. Once you've finished pounding the splint off the log, if you haven't had that privilege, you're going to have to determine what surface you're looking at. The splint obviously is coming off the log in long strips, the length of the log, and you're looking at growth rings that are running the entire circumference of the tree, and so this curve begins to give you an indication of what surface you're looking at. Obviously this is hugging the log, and so this is the outside of the tree. This material then needs to be cleaned if you're going to do a finer basket. If you choose not to, you can leave the surface in a rough state. This is actually the nourishing fibers of the tree, the cambium layer, and this is the actual growth ring itself. And the weight of the splint will vary according to the growth of the tree and the climate and the amount of moisture it gets per year. And now that we have the surface determined, we've begun to decide that this is the top or outside of the tree, and this will be the outside of the basket because this side will clean will clean the best. So the material can be just scraped, and the best thing to use is a piece of leather in order to prevent you wearing your apron out. And just pull the material through the knife rather than scraping it this way. You can use a paint scraper, which can be sharpened, and you can lay it flat and sort of scrape the surface off. I'm going to show you a couple of techniques and tell you which one I think is best for someone who's first starting out. You must also remember that because of the curve and you're flattening it against your leg, this surface will actually clean the best. The other surface, which is this cupped or inside surface, when you place the knife down and as much pressure as you put on the piece of splint, you're basically only going to clean a certain amount. The high edges will clean first, and you perhaps will be lucky enough to get inside there. Remember that this surface, the inside surface or the cupping surface of this splint, basically will remain inside the basket once you build the basket. And so really to be obsessive compulsive about the appearance of this side is really unnecessary. The other thing too is that if you're going to divide the splint because of the heft of it, if you want to split it down the middle and make two splints rather than one, you're going to reveal an interior satiny surface, and so to worry about a whole lot of cleaning is really unnecessary because the inside surface is what you're going to actually use in the outside of the basket. When you dig too far or too deep, you're going to end up with very thin spots once you divide the splint, and that's going to weaken the basket. So the best thing really to do is to just cut the material and divide it. Just take your knife and just crease the surface. You don't need to go very deep. Break the surface back, and if it doesn't come apart, sort of twist it. You'll begin to notice a tab will appear, and you can then begin to pull it apart. And if you look down on the material, you can begin to see that you're pulling evenly into the center, and you can begin to feel it also with your fingers. Continue to pull. And notice that this is a sort of a rolling motion into my thumbs. I'm sort of pushing it up with my fingers into my thumbs, and I'm using my thumbs and my first fingers as being the sort of gauge. Now, this is kind of fun to do for a while, but it gets to be really boring. The Indians used to have two pieces of wood that would come up in sort of teepee-like fashion. The splint would be fished up through that splint, through that opening of the two pieces of wood held by the knees, and they would pull it down over the edge. This is just two pieces of wood with a slot in between, and the splint can in fact be pushed down or fished up through that slot. And once you have started the splint dividing, then you want to make sure that you keep the edges against the side of the box, and you let the box do the work at this point. And so you just pull it slowly and evenly against the sides of the box, and you've created two pieces of splint. Now that you've revealed that satiny interior that we talked about, and that's going to be to the outside of the basket. It's like everything, you put your best foot forward. The inside of the basket is still that rough edge, and it is at this point I would suggest that you do your cleaning rather than initially, until you get really good at it. Once you get good at it, then you can clean and subdivide and not get any thin spots because of gouging. The next process would be obviously needing to cut your material. If you're right-handed, and there's kind of a joke about these orange-handled scissors, when you work in a museum you obviously have to use period scissors, and they don't work terribly well, but I suggest you get a pair of just cheap orange-handled scissors and throw them away, get them on sale. You want to start with a straight edge. So the first thing to do is to straighten the edge of your material. And this isn't too bad. And if you're right-handed, cut from the left margin to the right margin. And you'll see the reasoning behind that is that the blade of the scissors doesn't get in the way, and you can actually see that you're cutting evenly. Once you have it straight, then you want to determine, in this case, what you're going to be cutting. If you're going to be cutting weavers, obviously they're going to be narrower, and you're going to have to try to get them very even. If you cut weavers by hand, rather than using a gauge, a tool that I'll show you in just a moment, do it very carefully. Don't race this part and get anxious about getting into making the basket. The basket is only as good as you make the parts. So you want to make sure that you spend the time to cut this very evenly and sort of cut to a point, and then continue to make sure that it's done evenly. The ribs can be a little off, and that sort of creates kind of a nice ambiance to the basket. It doesn't look, manufactured. It shows the handwork. But if the weavers are totally irregular, the basket is just going to look sloppy, and nobody buys sloppy. This is a cutting gauge, and basically we're going back again to another Indian technique. These blades are X-Acto razor blades, but Indians were using clock spring, the little spring that you find that drives the clock. They would cut it into short pieces and sharpen it, embed it into a piece of wood, and pull it through. The problem with this particular kind of contemporary X-Acto razor blade is that it's a little heavy, and so it tends to drag a little bit when you start to pull the splint through. But This helps you cut the material in a rather quick fashion. And there's a variety of ways of doing this, and you can, explore these personally. You pull it down on the blades, and then pull, and you find that will cut your splints in a nice, quick and even fashion. The next thing we want to do, obviously, is build a basket. And we need to plan this, but not to a great degree. We're going to build a round basket, and let's sort of just decide how high and how big a basket. And I have one already woven, but let's sort of try to approximate what that one is already going to look like. So this is going to be about the height of the basket, perhaps a little shorter. When you pound this material, you sort of treat it like gold, and so don't waste it. This would be about the height that I'm going to do, and so I'd take a pair of scissors and I would clip that. This piece that's left over can be used for a smaller basket, so just reserve it. And as I told you before, we'll cut it down the middle. And this is going to be making the ribs for this round basket. All right, as I said previously, we've determined the height of the basket that we're going to build, and now I've cut these splints. These are the ribs of the basket, sort of the structure of the basket that we're going to weave the weavers around to this width. Now, the one thing that you need to do is obviously plan what width rib you're going to cut. If you're going to use 2 sets of ribs or a double bottom basket, one of the baskets that we're going to build today, then you don't need as wide a rib as you would if you were going to build just a single ribbed basket in a round fashion. So these I've cut fairly narrow, and like every basket, you need to plan this. So we need to fold it in half to get the center, and because we're going to weave from the center out, and we want a nice tight basket, we're going to weave fairly close to that center, as close as we can get it, so we need to narrow that. Otherwise, when you lay all the ribs in an outward fashion in a circle, you're going to have too big a center to be able to get really close in. So we're going to taper it down about the length of a scissor cutting toward my thumb, and then a length of scissor away, turn it over, and we'll do that again. This is a single bottom basket that I was talking about, and as you can see, we've turned it inside, and it's the same rib inside and out. And you can see I've narrowed that. This is what we're talking about here. That narrowing is right here, so that I can get into the center quite closely, and it makes a nice tight bottom. This is the double bottom basket that I'm going to be building partly today, and then we'll be finishing up also. It shows you where the inside of the basket has one bottom, and if you turn it over, it has a second bottom, which is added after you've woven for a point. Now obviously, I've planned the spaces and the width of the ribs so that they don't jam together. We want to make sure that there's some spaces in between, but we also want to make sure that the spaces are not excessive between the ribs. If you do, the basket's just going to be weak. So plan the size of the basket, plan the size of the rib that you intend to weave, and if you find that as you work the basket that the spaces are too far apart, just add a second set of ribs. And we've shaped our ribs. The next thing to do is to lay out the bottom. Start with 4 and just sort of lay them randomly, but you need to make sure that the distances as you lay them out are equidistant. Also concern yourself with the surface. If you're going to weave from the outside of the basket, as some people do, you want to make sure that you see the best side. If you're going to weave from the inside, obviously the best side of the basket, or the side that you intend to show to the outside, needs to be face down. And I, in fact, weave from the inside of the basket, so I'll put the very best surface against the table. I'll lay this out. Now I have 4. Now you want to make sure that you don't jump around at this point. So you have a sort of a pie cut up. Now you want to place it in between, and do this in a sequence. And as you can see, I'm going from around this way, and I'm going to lay it so that I divide those spaces in half. And don't be concerned so much with little ends like this, because we're going to be tucking these down anyhow. So if it's a little short, It won't really matter. Taking a weaver that we've soaked, again, taking notice of the surface that's the best side, and again, because I want to work from the inside of the basket, I'm going to make sure that the best side is face down. And I want to lock all of these ribs in place. I start over the top of one of the ribs. Make sure that you pull it in. You can spin it around a little bit. This is called a keeper. And basically all it does is keep everything in place. And it's nice. It's a nice technique rather than start weaving immediately, because if you get interrupted and somebody comes along and bumps this, it's not going to fall out of sequence and it's not going to get disrupted. And you can actually weave these ahead of time and pick it up and go back to it. Make sure that you get it in tight. You start off with a poor beginning and your basket isn't going to get any better. And then come over the top of that piece that you started. And you want to weave on top of that as if you were weaving one right over the other until you get it in place and locked in place. And again, play with it, move it, push it, anything that's necessary to get that. So you're weaving right on top of itself until it sort of locks itself in place, and then clip it off. Because we need an uneven number of ribs to be able to spiral the basket up. Now, spiraling is one technique. Building it row by row is another technique. Building row by row makes sure that you have a very level and even basket. It also enables you to curlicue, as the Indians did, to embellish the surface more completely and more accurately. But I tend to spiral almost all of my baskets up rather than building row by row. It just happens to be the way I do it. And so I am now going to create an uneven number, and obviously because we have 8 members this way, we have an even number divisible by 2, and I need an uneven number so that I'm not going over what I went over as I go around the basket. I need to split one of these, and so I will split this one because it happens to be the wider, and also make sure that it's not a weak member that you're splitting. This material you control, but lots of times reed you don't control because the weight is predetermined by the manufacturer. You're the manufacturer in this regard. So you want to make sure that you've got a good strong rib so that when you've divided it and weakened the width of it, that it isn't going to buckle and ripple and look unattractive in the basket. This one just happens to have a nice wide one. You can always pre-plan it. So I'll split that down the middle. Being careful not to cut through the keeper. Just pull it a little bit and it'll rip the rest of the way. Now we'll take another piece of splint from the bucket. And because we're going to start weaving on an uphill spiral, we need to sort of conceal the beginning of that so it doesn't look so abrupt. And a square end and a start is a rather abrupt beginning, so we'll narrow that down to a little point. We'll do this only twice. Once in the beginning and once at the very end of the basket when we stop weaving. We're going to always start at the split, we'll end at the split. And in this case, when we're making a double bottom basket, we'll work at the split when we add. And what are we talking about adding? Obviously, if I wove this basket out very far and started to turn it up, I've got tremendous distances, and you can see in this now, quite visually, that this part, if I wove this far out, would be so far from this rib that I'd have a very weak basket. So when we talk about adding and making a double bottom, we're just filling the space so that we don't have that weakness. So we'll start here, taking notice of the weaving pattern. It's over, this is under. We'll pull the split apart, and we'll slide this piece in, this little sharpened piece, and catch it underneath, and really now pay attention to the weaving pattern. And as you can see here, I've slid it under, and this will go over, and then this piece will go under. So it's now doing the over and under pattern. Now we're at the split again, and we're going to treat the split as 2. And so I'm going to separate that split, and I'm going to go in between them. And you can see that we're now beginning where I was over before, I'm under, and that pattern will continue all the way around. We'll continue to weave out and add, and we'll show you in how to add a piece of splint so that you can seal the ends in just a moment. But we're going to weave to a point where we have enough space to add the second set of ribs. I've stopped over this rib, and that's always stop over a rib, and then counting that as 1, go back 1, 2, 3, 4. Lift this one, the fourth one, up. Take your splint, right side, check the side to make sure that you've got the good side out, because in fact I'm weaving from the inside. And insert it and place it over the top of that and weave over the top of the lower weaver and go right over the top of the piece that you've clipped off. Now if that pops out, don't worry about that, because the next time around the weaver will catch it and hold it in place. And we're at the point of adding the second set of ribs in order to fill the spaces in between. We're at the split, which is the point we started the basket, and it's the point where we'll start adding. As you can see, the pattern of the weaving is under and over, and if I add another rib and want to secure it in place, it will need to come over both of those. And in fact, we're altering the weaving pattern, and this will happen at this point and at the ending of adding all of these all of the second set of ribs, and then we'll go back to a standard weaving pattern. And you'll find when you get to this point, you'll have to do this, and it will work at this point by just going over 2, securing it, adding the next one, and securing it, the next, and so on, so that you finish all of them. And we'll get those all added in, and then I'll show you how the pattern changes here once more, and then we'll continue to weave out, and then I'll show you how to curve the basket up. We're coming around to that split I talked about previously. Notice the pattern's looking kind of nice here, and we're filling these spaces so that the basket's going to be a nice strong one. We're around to the split again, and in order to now change that weaving pattern so that we get into that over and under again, and we're not going, see, I'd be going right over the top of the same thing. I'm going to now slide it under that one, and you're going to find that that will now pull it into the, see how I've done that? I've gone under it, and I'm actually sliding underneath that, and I'm just altering that pattern one more time, and you'll find that when you go around the next time and you treat each one of these now as an individual upright member, that pattern of weaving over and under will fall into place. And notice how attractive the center looks. You've got a little hump in there, and that hump in the basket automatically happens because of all of this extra added material, and then it's accentuated later on by the weaver or in the molding of the basket over a form, so that the weight of what you put inside the basket is distributed. So, all right, we've woven out a fair distance, and now we're going to begin to want to start to curve this basket up slightly. If you were going to wait out to here, you'd end up with a shallow curve to the side. So anytime you deem it is appropriate to begin to curve the basket up, obviously you've got to have enough of a bottom to be able to get something in it, unless you're making some little trinkety type basket, which would be smaller inside. So how do you start to pull the basket up and make it round? And in fact, all you do is pull harder on the weaver, and you can begin to see just by that alone how the basket's beginning to come up. If in fact it gives you problems and doesn't do it, you tell it it's going to happen, and you form these a little bit. And it's really almost like sculpture. You're sculpting the basket out of a soft, pliable wood. And if you have a wooden form, and I'm going to show you what that form looked like, an antique one, and show you a basket that I wove on that form, and what the difference is in the bases of a form woven basket versus a free-handed basket. give you a little comparison, and I'm going to show you a single bottom basket to talk to you a little bit about that curve and how the curve should look, a little bit about the outside. But you can see I'm giving a little bit of a pressure. I had a little bit of a fracture there in the wood. But if I come around again with a weaver, that'll hold that in place. Again, it's on the inside, so don't really concern yourself with it. You can always clip it, come back, join it as I showed you previously, and that will be gone. But you can see just by forcing it up. See how the sides are beginning to curve, and that's what we're looking for. And then if we want this hump in the bottom of the basket to be accentuated, we can push it up. The Southern tradition was they used to punch it up with their fist. And it seems that in New England they used to put it over their knee and sort of crown it up with their knee. So we'll just continue to weave for a moment just to show you how it's beginning to curve up. And let's just set this aside for a minute, and I'll show you a single bottom basket that shows you the curve, a little bit about the outside appearance of the basket. A lot of people seem to be concerned about the fact that the material doesn't lie perfectly flat to the rib of the basket. Remember, you're taking a flat material, a piece of wood that's flat by nature, and you're making it round. And so you're going to have the upper surface of the wood, the upper top part of the wood, weaver, lying flat, but you're going to have the lower part sort of floating away from the basket. This is frequently referred to as cupping. Lots of people say, well, gee, my basket doesn't look perfectly flat. It isn't going to be perfectly flat, so just accept that this is part of the weaving process and go from there. The curve of this basket is a very gradual one. You don't want the basket to come up in a very rakish angle. It's supposed to be pleasant to the eye. And so let's just be a little careful when you're shaping your basket and weaving that you don't pull too hard. If you pull too hard, the sides are going to come up very quickly, and that's a sign of an amateur. If we're going to try to conceal the fact that we haven't been doing it very long, let's try to hide it a little bit by learning that a basket that toes in at the top or caves in at the top, unless it's a planned basket, sort of reveals that the person is inexperienced with the tensions of the weaving. The Shakers by 1840 were doing almost 80 styles of baskets, and I'll show you one of theirs, which is a reproduction of an old one that's at the museum at Hancock. Now here's an antique. This one even happens to be signed with the stamp of the maker on it. You can see the bottom begins to look a lot different than the bottom that we have here. Ours, we've added the inside, the extra ribs to the inside, and this is added to the outside. That's the number one. Number two, the great symmetry. It matches the mold, and in fact, we can pull it off and see that this curve that we talked about previously being pushed on your knee is actually in the mold itself. This has a post, I think you can see here. That post allows this mold to spin around. So you don't even need to go around, chase around the mold with it. It actually allows you to spin it around. And all right, here's another mold. This happens to be a copy of a Shaker mold that's in our museum's collection. This mold would be called a puzzle mold, in so much as the sides are curved up, and if you wove the basket over this form, you're closing the top up so much that you can't get the form out of the basket. So this is called a puzzle mold because it comes apart in pieces, and you're able to pull the center section out, and the side sections would then collapse into the basket, allowing you to free it. We're now at the point where we want to finish off a round basket, and because we haven't had time to really weave the entire double bottom round basket, I have one that's a single bottom round basket, and let's take a look at that. If you remember, when we started out making the basket, we started with a tapered splint. We're now ending the basket, and just as we started at the split, we're going to end at the split. So the very last weaver, perhaps the distance of 4 or 5 ribs, we're going to taper or point down, narrow that splint, so that we're beginning to level the basket a bit. So that as we started upward, we're now ending in a downward fashion. You can sort of see this. And we tuck it in and behind, and taking care to note the pattern. And now we're going to add what is called a rim strip or a leveling strip. Lots of people weave or fold this over now, tuck and point these and fold these over and tie the basket down so that it doesn't unravel. I tend to use an older method that I found through doing doing basket research and working in various historic settings, and that is adding a band onto the top of this weaving, which I'll put the rims against and do the lashing to. And it just helps level the basket. It also allows you, should you be doing splint baskets and it shrinks, you can add a little bit at the top so that you can sort of fill a gap should you not get it dry enough the first time around or tight enough. All right, so this is important that you also remember that you need enough of splint at the top, enough of the rib at top, so that you can add this band and still have enough to be able to bend it over and tuck it down. Another thing that might prove interesting is lots of Indian baskets, and people are always saying, well, gee, how do you know if an Indian made it or not? They frequently bent their ribs both to the inside and to the outside. So that's another little way of perhaps telling an older basket that perhaps was made by a Native American. Let's put the rim on, the rim strip. All right. Inserting the piece of splint now, we just sort of lay it in and weave over the top of the last weaver, making sure that it is weaving into that pattern so that it doesn't match the pattern below. And because we split an upright, we're going to have to alter the weaving pattern, or we're going to end up matching part of it. So let's see where we'll come. And it'll probably be at the split, because that's where we ended the basket, so there'll be some sort of an adjustment in that pattern. So here we end up here. And we're going to now float over 2 ribs. And there we go. And now we're going to go right over the top of what we had there before, catching it and securing it in place. Take a pair of scissors, and we're going to snip it off. And let's blunt point these ends. We're blunt pointing the ribs that go over the top of the basket and would tuck down into the inside. And these we're going to now place in our pan over here for just a few seconds, and we're going to soak these. If we put the whole basket back in the water, all it's going to do is soak right back up. So don't do that. Just soak these tops, and we're going to do that now, and then we're going to fold these over, and we'll cut these off. And as I said previously, the Indians used to blunt point these and bend these over to the outside. Now we're going to bring it over and begin to insert these tabs down into the basket. This is a little hard to see, and so I'll try to do it very carefully. Pulling down against the material so you make sure that the basket is not loosened up. And if your basket loosens a little bit, and you're worried about the fact that it keeps shoving up, just mist it slightly. Don't soak it, because the basket's going to, once it dries out again, it's going to end up with gaps. But just mist it so that it raises the little hairs on the wood and it doesn't slide around. And then you can tighten it down and it won't slide on you. And now you're going to take these blunt points and bend it over that last big fat strip that you put on and shove it in behind the weavers and tuck it down. And you're going to do that to all of them. Now these happen to be really quite thin, so they fold over very easily. As you can see, I'm not having any difficulty. You're making a big basket. Your ribs should be a lot sturdier, a lot heavier than these, and you need to plan that. You know, you don't make a huge basket with flimsy ribs and wonder why the thing falls apart. You end up with a whole bunch of unpointed pieces left over, and as I said, the Indians pointed them and tucked them over to the outside. Yankees or every other kind of basket makers are quick and simple, just cut them off. We're going to set this aside. We're going to talk just briefly about how to start a square basket, and then we're going to really get into making handles and rims for this. All right, now we're going to just quickly show you how to lay out the bottom of a square or a rectangular basket, and I'm going to give you a couple of little helpful tips, and then we're going to go right into making a handle. But first, plan your ribs. Don't make them, again, too weak. Don't make them too wide. Plan the basket the size that you need. Lay 3 of them out, and then in the middle cross two of the ribs. And it is from this point, now you have equidistance, the spaces here and here and here and here, and it's from here that you'll start to build the basket from center, top and bottom. And again, if you're building, I'm building this from the face of this is the inside, so the worst of the splint is to the inside, and left and right. And you can pretty much understand this process without a whole lot of time being spent on this. This way your holes are even, and you're not weaving over 7 this way and weaving over 7 this way, and then you find that your holes are too small or too large. Then you can tighten these down quite comfortably. So you weave out from the center of the basket, and that way you don't end up with great long pieces out here and great long pieces out here, so it's more comfortable to handle. And frequently I'll lay a board underneath this with the pattern of the bottom that I intend to make, and I'll build within that board. And so, or you can put a graph, a plastic graph underneath it, so that you know that the size that you're building is approximately the size of the basket you're after. Once you get this built out, let's just put a couple more in just for visuals. I'm not going to pay any attention to whether I'm going top or bottom, left and right at the moment. Just get so the holes are somewhat even. And again, as I said, we would have put keeping strip around. And when we get to this corner, let's just show you how that corner is treated. You would pull that down real tight. Instead of worrying about the surface of the splint being the same, which you would once you start to weave, you can fold it over so that you get a nice mitered corner and in there good and tight, rather than worry about this surface isn't the same as this surface. So that's the way you would lay your keeping strip. And rather than worry that this surface is shiny, and then when we fold it over that this is not shiny, this is a rougher surface, don't worry about that. This is just one small strand in the entire structure of the basket, and it really gets lost. So just bring that in, fold it over so you get a nice, neat, mitered corner there. And as I say, the same deal holds with this basket. As you go all the way around the outside of this grid, you want to then float over the top of this and tie it down and clip it off so that holds it from shifting on you. And then you can start worrying about weaving. The other thing we're going to just briefly touch upon is that in a square basket, don't worry about the fact that this basket doesn't come up and look really like a square for about 4 or 5 rows. It's really hard to get a square basket to look good for a while. Just make sure that when you're forming the square basket that you form the corners nice and neat, and that you have your splint in nice and tight and even, and it'll eventually get there. Now frequently I'll also turn a basket up quite quickly by putting a real wide band at the bottom, a couple of wide bands, and weaving up. Next thing I want to talk about is just chase weaving, which is this process of weaving with one strand that you fold over that becomes 2 strands, and that you basically then don't have to cut one of the uprights. We talked about an uneven number of uprights. By weaving with 2 strands, and I'll quickly show you how this happens, you don't have to split one of the verticals, so that you get a terrifically symmetrical basket. And the same process again. Take the splint, narrow it way, way down, a long taper, almost to a point of just tissue, thread thin. If I were going to start with this piece of splint, I would only do this once, and the rest of the time until I finish the basket, just like we finished the round basket, I would not taper down to end until the very end when I finish the weaving of the basket. So this process is, again, only done at the beginning and done at the end, just like the round basket. But the joining of the splints, as we did in the previous basket, is done on 2 ends, because we're going to fold this over so that we now are coming around a rib. And let's bring it over to this basket, and I'll show you how we do this. Taking note again of this weaving pattern here, and this is going over This we want to go under. So we'll lift this rib, and this would go under. So we've taken that real thin point and we've brought that under there, and now we're going to weave that into the pattern. And then we'll fold this back and we'll weave this as if it were now two separate members, two separate weavers, and that's in fact what it is, even though it's one bent back on itself. And you'll merely chase around the basket this way, this fashion of just chasing around the basket with now two strands at one time, so you don't have to have one of these split. And it makes a very symmetrical looking basket. And you join just as you would have joined else in the basket. You would say we're going to join here, clip, and we would go back, 1, 2, 3, 4, lift it, slide under, over the top of what we just woven, and that join then disappears. Weaving a square basket is pretty frustrating to people because they don't get the immediate shape that they're looking for. We're finally at the point where we're going to add a handle to a basket and put the rim on it and finish it off. The height of the handle is frequently 1/2 the circumference of the basket. So if you just take a piece of splint and go halfway around and find your location where you're directly in the middle and roll it up, that's frequently the height of the handle. Now from that point, so that's the length of the handle from the rim over to the other side of the rim. So your handle is not just that long. If you don't have extra length that you shove down into the basket, obviously you've got too short a handle. So you consider the amount of splint that you need, or the amount of handle you need to shove down into the basket and inserting it on both sides. The other thing too is that you don't insert a handle right from the top of the rim of the basket. It kind of tortures those upper weavers if you skip a few, and we'll get into that a little bit later. This wood is hickory, and I've split it out, and we'll get into splitting in just a few minutes, but I would take this handle now and place it away from the base of the stick so that I have enough to be able to slide down into the basket quite a bit. I don't like handles that are inserted into a basket just a couple of inches. They have a tendency to rock back and forth. So I give more than enough. You can always cut it off, but you can't add it. So I would mark that with a pencil, and that would be the length. That's the rim, the top of the rim of the basket. I come over and we talked about the total length from rim to rim as being here, and then I'll match this distance here to here, and I'll then use a saw and cut that off. All right, we've laid out, as I said before, our handle, and this is the area that we're going to start to carve. This is going to be, again, from here to here. This is the part that slides down into the basket. Now, fortunately, I've split this piece of wood pretty straight, so it doesn't need a whole lot of cleaning up. But if you haven't been fortunate enough to be able to split your wood out so that the crack down the piece of wood is even, you're going to have to square this up and sort of rough it out before you really begin to fine carve anything. So place it into the jaw of the shave horse and start to pull a draw knife down. And the draw knife is nothing more than just that. It is a knife that you draw toward you. There's a lot of controversy about what side of the draw knife to use, and my answer to that is whatever side you want to use, whatever works best. I use both surfaces depending upon the job that's being done. So I square this up. Notice that I'm working basically from center out. I turn the stick around. I don't go the full length of the wood. I roll it over on its edge, clean that edge up a little bit. Basically, I'm just sizing the stick. The next thing is we've cleaned up this piece of wood the whole length, and we've got it pretty even now. As you can see, it's a fairly even stick. It's pretty hard to try to start carving a handle unless it's squared up. I've transferred the lines again, and I continue to transfer the lines as I clean up the edges so that I don't lose it and have to go back to it. Now I begin to really start to carve. The first thing I'm going to do is create the handle, which is between this distance and this distance. Then I'm going to create what's called a shoulder or a lug, which is the area where the rim will fit in, and then I'll taper this end in a downward sort of ski hill slope so that it'll slide into the basket comfortably. So let's get started. Remember, we'll be carving with this surface of the shave draw knife up, because I'm going to not want to dig too far down. There's some real technique going on with the surfaces, and you can see there's different angles here, and you have to kind of explore this, but I'm going to turn it over this way, and I'm going to take a first dig out. And it's I like to make this scoop out a very sharp angle, and that means that if I don't have a real concentration of thickness there, I can bend that handle the whole length wherever I want to. So I take a fairly sharp angle out here. Plus, if you're going to hand carve something, show it's carved. Now notice I'm not going the whole length of the stick, but I'm going halfway, and I'm going to come back, and I'm going to take this waste out. I'm going to keep digging deeper and deeper if I don't remove this, and I'm not going to know where I am. So I'm going to dig a little bit and turn it around back into the jaws, scoop it out, and back. And you can see how much I thinned this piece of wood already. Here again, you can see the thick part of the handle that remains, and the thinned part, which is actually the handle itself. This is all going to be the taper or the tab that you're going to insert into the basket. And this part here is going to be where the rim is going to be cut into it. So you can sort of see this profile and see how really quite pronounced this curve is in here. It's not gradual. It's so I can bend all the way down to here if I choose to. I won't, but it allows me to shape the handle more freely if I don't have a lot of heft in there. And now we'll drop it back into the jaws, push it forward again. And now I'm going to leave about an inch or inch and a half distance here. I'm going to take the draw knife again, and I'm going to pull this all away. We're going to do just a little bit of detailing with the jackknife, and again, the piece of leather. The technique is a fairly simple one. Instead of whittling, which doesn't give you any control, you merely hold the knife stationary as if it were a plain blade, and you pull the knife, or you pull the wood against the knife, and it begins to carve away, and you turn it around again halfway. This is a 50-cent word called chamfer, and it's to take the edges off of a piece so that the angle is not at a 90-degree angle, but somewhat around a 45-degree angle. It's amazing that if you don't do this, and I'm going to come back on that. Normally I'd turn it around, but lots of carvers carve toward themselves, and until you get used to that, that's a little bit dangerous. So I'm chamfering the edges and creating sort of a nice profile for this handle. And then this is the part that we're going to insert again in the basket. And I take the edge off of that so that when I shove it down into the basket, it doesn't have any possibility of cutting perhaps a weaver. So I just sort of make it look a little bit better. And if I want to sand it, I could sand it, but I usually take the knife and just move it back and forth in a very quick fashion back. And that scraping back and forth is sort of like scraping a piece of cabinet wood. And if it chatters, you just scrape it back in the opposite direction that it's chattering, and that chattering will disappear. All right, I continue to support the bend while I'm bending this handle now that I've gotten a little bit of detail. And let's talk a little bit about what this handle is. It's hickory, and I tend to like hickory a lot. It seems to be a wood that I can find fairly readily, and I can cure it so that it underwater so that it's very flexible. You know, there was a tune taught to the tune of a hickory stick, and there was a reason for it. A student not picking hickory because something would break before the stick would break in punishing. So what I've done is I've really sort of stressed that all the way along, and now I can take the piece of wood and I can just bend it without it breaking. Now I'm going to insert it into the basket. With the basket now, as I said before, we want to insert this, and we want it wide enough so that it's about the width of the rib. If it's a narrower handle than the width of the rib and you don't shove it way down in, it's going to rock back and forth. I also said that if you insert the handle right at the very top, with this sort of taper triangle in here, it begins to really push those splints forward and really kind of tortures them. If you look at baskets, they often skip a number of weavers. So why don't we, in this case, skip 5? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we'll shove that down in. And it's a deep insertion. You see, I like to go way down. It's less apt to get rocked. It's here that we're going to be putting the rim, and you can see that thickened part called the shoulder or lug, and that's where we're going to cut the notch. And in fact, that will be where we'll start doing our sawing once we get our rim ready, and let's get that ready. We have a piece of hickory, which is a pignut hickory, and pignut is one of the varieties of hickory, and we're going to be using that today to do our handles. The outside of the bark gives you an indication of the way the curves are. It's curved around the tree, and therefore the growth rings are stacked one on top of another, and with the curve running this way to the outside. So anything that we're going to bend, the curve of the handle, we want the outside of the tree to be that curve, and it'll become fairly clear to you when you start to bend the wood as to which way the growth ring should be, and it will resist bending when it's against the growth ring. And so when you start to flex the wood, if it seems like it's resisting a bend, you perhaps have the growth rings in the wrong direction, and just turn it around and see if it works the other way. If the wood is very, very supple and very fresh or water cured, it'll bend without a whole lot of difficulty. We're going to take the bark off first. And this is really a portion of a pie-shaped wedge of wood that we've split out of the log. And you split it by quartering it and then splitting in half and in half again till you come down to a pie-shaped wedge, a small piece of wood approximately the size that you intend to use. Split the heartwood out of it, and this is the sapwood, and that's what we're going to be using. So let's take the bark off, and we're going to use a tool that's pretty ancient to basket making and a lot of other trades. And it's called a froe and just a mallet, and we'll ease this off by using this metal tool. I'll insert it down into between the bark and the wood, and just sort of rocking it out, you can sort of begin to peel the bark off. If the tree is extremely fresh, you can get it to sort of come off in one big motion. The other thing is, if the tree is frozen and you do this in the winter, the bark comes off real easy. I've taken the draw knife and I've gone ahead and pulled the bark off the rest of the way, just like we did the other part of the handle. And now I'm going to just place the froe in the middle of these growth rings. Remember, you're always splitting in half, whether you split this way or this way. I'm going to split that in half. A good resounding whack once you get it placed. And you can see that I've pushed the draw knife down into the middle. And I will now continue to rock that draw knife, or froe rather, back and forth until I get it to split down the middle. If it goes off a little bit, you just pull it a little harder on the thicker side and the crack will come back into the center. So, continuing the split, always remember too that you split best the shortest distance. So now I want to make 2 sticks out of this, so I'm going to split it this way rather than this way. It's harder to do. So I'll just place my knife in here and just get it started. and just twist it a little bit, and that'll start the crack going down the piece of wood. And now I'm going to lift it up and again pull it apart with my hands. I think it's easier if you can control it. Notice I'm trying to slowly pull it apart, not to rip it apart quickly because the crack is apt to go off. All right, we've got the rims now, and we've pulled the handle out of the basket, and we've sort of flattened it out. Don't worry about it still being too dry. It's so wet at this point that it's still very supple. And once you get good at carving rims, you don't have to worry about marking the spot and returning it to the same spot so you don't end up with a gap in the channel that you're going to cut in here. But until you do that, you might want to fit it a little bit more exactly and put a little reference mark to make sure that you're always returning the rim to the same spot, and put one here and in the direction that you've inserted the hand or the rim. But for this, I feel fairly confident that it's pretty much even the entire length, and so I'm going to give myself a little distance here, and then I'm going to mark on either side of that rim a pencil line. And then I'm going to turn it over, and I'm going to do the same thing here, giving myself the same amount of shoulder. Now that pencil, remember, is to the outside of this rim, and if you cut on that pencil line, exactly, the rim is going to be too sloppy in that notch that we're going to pop out. So you want to, when you remove it to get ready to saw it, you want to saw so that you see those pencil lines remaining. So I'm going to saw inside these pencil lines here and here so that they remain, and then I'll cut down into this more than halfway. I want this rim to really fit down in there, and if I don't carve or cut away more than half, it's going to stand out away from the basket, and it's going to look a little unattractive. So we want to come way down into here. Don't worry about it being too weak. This is a very strong wood, so we want to remove more than half of it. And if for some reason this shoulder then looks too pronounced and the rim gets lost in this sort of recess, just knock off this edge. You've got plenty here, and you can just take your draw knife and knock it off. Your pencil line remaining, you take your saw and begin to make sure you clamp it down in the jaws of this quite well. And again, halfway through or better, preferably better. Again, remaining pencil line. Make sure your saw marks line up, because you're going to pop this out, and if they don't line up and you've cut too deep on one side and not deep enough on the other side, you have the tendency to maybe pop this whole thing off, and you got to start over again. So get it even, and then I'll show you how to easily pop this out. You can take a chisel and drive it through and pop it out, but we place a knife well into the throat of that knife so that we're not going to break the blade off. We want to reach way down into that kerf so that it's way down in, and we want to roll that knife back. And that snap was the piece of wood breaking, and you can just see now that it's cracked out of there. You can just pop it out. And let's insert the handle back in so that it's now the rim notch is level to that rim strip that we've put on previously. Just bend it back around. Make sure you're putting it in the right position again. There's nothing worse than getting a handle in off center. Grab one of our rims, flex it so that it'll fit in, and start to fit it to the inside of the basket. If for some reason your notch is too narrow, don't recut the notch. Narrow the rim down slightly. Or stretch it out. But get it in there good and tight. Remember, this is soaked wood, and it's going to shrink a bit, and you don't want the rim to slop around in the handle. You can see that I'm way over in length, and I could have had that a lot shorter, and it would have been a little easier for me to carve. I like to overlap at least 1.5 inches in this distance on both, so that means a 3-inch overlap, so there's some strength to it. And I also do my overlapping near the handle, so the handle acts as sort of a camouflage so that you don't see where the join is. And the other thing too is that I join my rims together so that they're near each other on the same side. A lot of people join them onto the opposite sides of the basket, and that to me doesn't make any sense, because when you're tightening the basket you want this to sort of move around, and if it moves around and stops on one side and then goes halfway the other way, you can't really get a good tight lashing. So this is the way I do it. I invite you to explore this as a possibility and look at old baskets. There's a variety of different ways of doing it. Lay the two rims over one another and then just take a pencil, mark behind so you can see where you're going to have to do your tapering, so that the rims, when they lay over each other, really fit nicely and you don't have a thickened spot in the overlap of where the two rims join. And we'll return that. So if you mark underneath and on the top, then you'll know which sides you're going to be doing your tapering and to what length. And then we'll put it on the shave horse and give it a slice with the draw knife. You can see our pencil line, and that's going to be where we're going to start this downhill taper. And that taper is going to be done so that there's virtually nothing off of this upper edge, and everything down here will be very thin. And they'll lay over each other quite like this, so that when they join, there isn't a big thick bulge in that taper. So let's just take the draw knife and place it here, and just take nothing off that surface and just pull down. Pull off the waist and continue to work that so that we get a nice thin taper. Bring them around just to make sure they check. You check to see that they fit well and that they don't exceed the thickness of the rim in any other point. And now you return it to the basket. You can see where I've now joined the two overlaps together fairly close to the handle. I've put a wooden clamp on it and another one to hold it in place here. These clamps are handmade, and I find that they work really well. They hold the rims very tight, but you can use commercially available clamps such as this one, but make sure it has some sort of little plastic device to protect it from creasing the wood. First thing we're going to do is start with the steeples or ears for the handle of the swing handle basket that we're going to finish up with, and we'll be lashing that and putting the rims on and showing the final assembly and a little bit of detailing on the bottom of the basket. The best thing to start with is to start with a small stick. We need to make two of these steeples because the handle is going to be swinging back and forth on two of these, and I'm going to show you how to carve one and then split it in half, which is how you match handles rather than carve two. So you start with an estimate of how long you need to make the steeple, and you can just sort of estimate it. Find a stick that's near that. The next thing to do is to decide how big a loop that little steeple is going to be. And I've found through experience that it's just shy of 2 inches. It looks nice and aesthetically pleasing. So what I've done is I frequently will take a stick and I will transfer those measurements onto a stick. And if you can see these little dark lines here, that's the opening for the loop or on the bail of the handle, and I will use these sticks frequently as sort of a measuring device rather than constantly referring to a tape measure. Again, these are the distances that I'm going to place on the stick. So I'm going to center it into this piece of wood, and I'm going to draw a line, and that's going to be where I'm going to do a saw cut so that I can begin to thin this area out so that that's the top of the loop. The other thing is, remember that we're talking about the curves of the growth ring being cupped up, and that's going to be the top of the handle. So it's important that you begin to understand this process a little more, that the curves to the outside of the tree are the top of that loop. You can either saw at an angle or you can saw straight up and down. I sort of saw at an angle so it looks a little more aesthetic. Turn it around in the jaws of the shave horse and come back. Okay? Place your jackknife in the kerf, and again, just pop that out. And if it's a nice straight piece of wood, that whole piece will come out. Clean it out, And now we're going to make 2 ears. We're going to actually split the length of the wood, and because it's a nice straight grain, and you're looking for a nice straight grain piece of wood, we'll now just take the knife, pull it towards us, get it started, and just crack it. And you can begin to see that the crack is beginning to go down the length of the piece. You now have 2 ears. So we now have one of these, and we've cleaned up the edges just a little bit. Now this is going to bend. If you bend it very slowly, very carefully, that will make one of your loops. You see where I'm beginning to bend that around. Nice and flexible. Now this is going to slide down. This part here is going to slide down into the basket, so we need to take a curve off of this side here. So let's take a cut off of this side so it'll slide down, and that loop will then be secured with a rim across the top of it. Remember, we're not taking this slice or this downhill taper on the same surface as this cut that we took out of this side. Turn it around. Do the same thing to the other end. Remember, we're leaving the same kind of shoulder or lug area. We'll do it here, so that we have a place for the rim to notch into. And it's done. All right, we're going to next make a swing handle, and I have one here that's already been completed. And the ear or steeple that we made earlier, I've notched for the rim that we're going to be putting on. So this will actually fit in this area and allow that handle to swing back and forth. And remember that side cut that we made before will slide down into the basket on the outside. And I've notched it, as you can see, for the rim. I've already carved the rim previously, and we're going to use that same rim for this finishing of this basket. Now let's decide how big and how long the handle should be. A swing handle should just rest on the rim. So we're going to take remember, the steeple is going to go here on 2 of these uprights, or 2 of these ribs, and so it's going to be in the opposite area. It's going to take the same 2. And because we want this handle to rest right on the rim, we're going to measure, just with a piece of splint, half the circumference again of the basket. And that's going to be the length of the handle from the bottom of the loop to the bottom of the opposite loop. So we're going to lay that onto a stick and begin to measure. Remember, we talked about a 2-inch or just a little bit less of a 2-inch loop, just like I did with the ear or steeple. And that's the same sort of principle that we're going to use on the handle, except we're going to notch it out just a little bit to make it a little different shape. For clarity, I've drawn on this with a magic marker, but if you're going to be doing any kind of lines on wood, make sure it's pencil so that you can get it off. It's a little harder to get off. This is that 2-inch loop. It matches the ear or steeple that we made previously. And this is the lug, and this is a lug area that's going to fold over onto the top of this. So this is going to just make that loop and come back on itself. And then we're going to carve this away, and that's going to be the handle area, and it's going to match all the way down. This is where your handle's going to be. This is the lug. This part and this part will join each other. And then we're going to taper this down here a little bit, and a downward taper, so that when it folds over, it's not a big, thick area, and it looks attractive. And this is the pre-bent handle that I've tied with a sort of a waxed cord and bent to a curve. Remember, you've got to sort of form this, and it will want to stretch back out to a flat shape. So I've tied this one and I've let it dry a little bit ahead of time. But let's take this area here and compare it to the one below. And you can see that this loop is this area here. This is thinned down. The shoulder area has been thinned on this surface here, as it shows in this diagram. Again, sawing out just as we did with the other one, the ear. We want to get that out of there. Little angle cut looks better. Turn it around. You can see why I use a shave horse. It's just like a clamp. We'll pop that out and begin to carve the handle. As you can see, I've removed the waist area from here, and now I'm going to begin to leave that shoulder area here. Remember, we need to have something to fold this over and to tie it to, and to put a nail in, or whatever you're going to use to fasten it. Some people put pegs in there, some people put nails, rivets, whatever. If you're going to put a nail in there, by the way, you better drill it ahead of time once it's dried. Otherwise, you try to drive a nail in it, you'll crack your handle for sure. So we'll carve it away. Remember, halfway into the center, and then turn it around. And continue to do this until you get down to the thickness that you're looking for with the handle. It goes very quickly. Keep your tools good and sharp, and it goes very quickly. The final process is this area, and as I say, we could fold this over right now, bend it over, and this would meet this, and cut it off at a nice angle to match this curve here, and it would look all right. But it would be thick. So let's just take an angle cut off of this. This is a little longer than we need here. We'll bend it over and we'll do the final back cutting and sawing and sort of cleaning up on this area. And you can pretty much figure that out, how it will go. This sort of thins it down and makes it look more aesthetic. So we're approaching our pen line here. Clean this area up a little bit more in here. If it bends poorly, this bends poorly, it's a little too heavy. I think people have a tendency to want to think that this has to be incredibly thick in order to be successful and to hold together. It doesn't need to be. Wood is incredibly strong, even when it's very thin. I've cleaned up the edges a little bit. I've chamfered them a little bit and given them a little bit of a detail, just so it doesn't look square-edged. And remember, it bends easier if the edges are curved a little bit, so it's more attractive. Now we'll begin to sort of support it against your hand. Remember, carefully and slowly. You just don't grab a stick and bend it back on itself like this and without fracturing it a little bit, breaking the fibers and letting them know what's going to happen to them. They don't appreciate it. Slowly bend it back. See the loops beginning. Close it down and pull it together. At this point, you've got some hairs. You can pull a few of those, but as I said, if it looks like a whole lot of these are going to continue to do it, just leave them. Just sand it. See that? Now we have a little piece that's too long. We'll cut this off so it matches the curve of the handle. We'll tie it with a cord. We'll bend the handle, which is right there. See the whole handle? We'll bend it, tie it to the form that we intend it to be, and we'll insert it. After we get the ears and the rim in place and lashed in place, we can take this dried in the form that we're looking for, and we can just hook it into those loops, drill the hole, put a nail and clinch it over, and that's all we need to do. I want to show you a little trick where you can catch the end of the rim, which has been tapered down, as we did in the previous basket. You just catch it in one of these loops, and then you don't have to have a clamp or a clothespin or whatever you're using to hold it, and then it won't pop out on you and get out of the way. So it's just catch it under one of the loops, and then you continue to fit the rim. You can see where the notch is already out, and we're going to fit the rim in there. Pull it down, and then we're going to lash the basket. And this way you don't have to have a zillion clamps, and we continue to work it around and into this ear or steeple, and back around and then overlap. And now you only need one clamp. In lashing, cut a piece of lashing that's good size. Don't put a substantial basket together and then put a puny lashing. There's several ways of starting. Take a piece and pass it underneath the first rim, underneath and through the hole between the ribs, so it pushes underneath both rims. Pull it over the top and then tuck it down between the rim and the outside of the basket, and then go right over the top of it. And then you begin to lace. I lace my basket or lash my basket from the inside to the outside. I find that I can get that a tighter pull. If I'm going to cross bind the basket or cross lash the basket, you go in one direction, covering every hole, and in this case we'll overcast this ear here, and then when we come back, turn it around, and we'll just come back through the same holes again in the opposite direction. The X's or crosses will be on the top of the rim, and on the ear or steeple for the swing handle, it will be to the outside here. All right, I've run out of lashing material, and I need to start another piece, and I'm going to show you how to end this piece in a couple of fashions, and maybe how to add another piece in a different way other than we started the first time. You can go back that way. Another thing too is that when you want to double lash a basket and you want to know how long a piece to do it in one continuous strip, it's about 6 times the circumference of the basket. Just take the piece and bring it up under the inside rim and up between the basket and the rim. Go over the top of the basket and to the outside, between the outside of the basket and the outside of the rim. See how it's... I've just gone right over the top of the basket and to the outside of the, between the rim and the basket. And I pulled it down. Pull it down good and tight. Snug it down. And you can clip that off. A pair of scissors or clippers. And you can just shove this piece right up underneath that rim again. And just that angle will hold it. Or if you're concerned, you can go up underneath the rim and between the basket. And then the same fashion back down. And that will secure it. Now we want to end this, and because I don't have this space to fish that up, it's real tight in there. I'm going to just take the piece, go over the top to finish the last X. Go underneath the weavers on the inside. Go down 3 or 4. Pull it down. Skip one of those and go right back up underneath those again. And pull it up tight. That hooks it in. And just clip it off. A nice, neat, and old-time way of ending off a basket. Take our swing handle. Just hook it in, open up, and hook it in here. We would now drill a nail hole and another nail hole and bend it over very carefully. And you can see the handle swings out of the way and rests on the rim, which is what you want to do if you're going to dump the contents. By turning over the bottom of the basket, we take a piece of splint, that's a waste piece, and just sort of shape it. Point it a little bit at the ends. Between these ribs that you've added, catch it underneath a couple of weavers, bend it over the edge, and catch it underneath here. And do that every other rib so that you get an extra little skid in there. I'm going to skip over one. You can make a design. You can see where it's beginning to add a design around the outside of the basket, and it acts as a runner so that you don't wear the basket out by sliding it back and forth. Here's one that's already completed, and the skids or runners are here and here and here and all the way around. You can see, if you get a nice close-up of this, how much more attractive it is and how it really makes the basket protected as well. And these are just some of the details that you can add to a basket to just sort of individualize it, make it a little bit more attractive. I hope you've enjoyed this. It's been a real pleasure for me, and happy basket making.
Brookfield Craft Center was founded in 1954 as a nonprofit organization with a very special mission: to preserve and promote interest and learning of the skills of American craftsmen. Continuing the tradition begun over 30 years ago, Brookfield Craft Center offers a wide range of classes, workshops, and seminars for all abilities and interests, as well as sponsoring national exhibitions and professional conferences. Our instructors and exhibitors come from across America and throughout the world to share their fine skills and expertise with students and members. The main Brookfield Craft Center campus is located in western Connecticut in a cluster of historic buildings around a restored grist mill. There are a number of teaching studios, an exhibition gallery, a shop featuring work by local and national artists, administrative offices, and faculty housing. The South Norwalk, Connecticut campus is part of a historic renovation project. The Sono facility is a new one, with working artist studios for individual artists, groups, or craftsman cooperatives, in addition to classroom and gallery space. With a growing membership and an alumni base of many thousands of students, Brookfield Craft Center is continuing its long tradition of supporting the American craftsman. With the addition of our video library, we are expanding the opportunities to explore and learn our rich heritage of handcrafts.